Greetings, everybody. In this YouTube series, we will cover the entire NCERT political science textbook of class 11, which is the Indian Constitution at Work. This book covers the various aspects of the working of the Constitution in depth in a very lucid manner, and I will try my best to cover each and every detail that has been covered in this book. So, as you can see, there are a total of 10 chapters, and in this video, we will cover the first chapter, which is Constitution, Why and How. It is an introductory chapter to the Indian Constitution. These are some of the questions that this chapter would try to answer. So, do stick around till the end so that you get a comprehensive understanding of the chapter. So, let us begin. So basically, I have divided this chapter into three parts, and in the first part, we will look at the functions of a constitution. Okay, so the text begins by asking the readers to imagine themselves as a part of a large and diverse group. But if you are someone who is residing in India for some time, I don't think you need to imagine, because you are already a part of this large and diverse population, right? You must have seen people from different ages, practicing different religions, having different jobs around you. Now, the thing is, this large group has to live together. Now, why is that? Why do we have to live together? The text does not address this question, and I will leave it for you guys to explore. But the text does say that for all their diversity, this group has to live together. They are dependent upon each other in various ways. But the problem is that the people of this group, aka us, we disagree on many things. And it is quite natural for people to disagree on things. So, the members of this large and diverse group are bound to have disputes over resources, over important questions such as how much property should one be allowed to own, or should it be compulsory that every child be sent to school, or should the parents be allowed to decide, and many such questions. And you have to keep this in mind that we have limited resources, and compared to that, we have fairly large and diverse population. So these disputes, these contestations are bound to happen. So the problem is, how do we ensure cooperation among such a diverse group? How do we make sure that they live together peacefully despite these disputes, despite these differences? One might say that the solution is to come up with some basic rules, right? These rules, they must be publicly promulgated now, which means that these rules are made known to all the members. They are declared publicly so everybody knows about them. The purpose of this basic rule is to basically give this diverse group clarity and direction, right? Everybody knows what they can and cannot do, and this brings a sense of coordination. But the thing is, it's not enough for rules to exist, they must be also enforceable. If people don't follow the rules, there must be consequences placed. Otherwise, there would be no assurance, right? We need assurance that breaking rules will lead to punishment, and then that would ensure that everyone takes them seriously. So, a constitution serves as a framework. It gives you a fundamental framework that establishes these basic rules, these essential rules, which ensures coordination and gives a security to the members within a society. Thus, we get our first function of a constitution, which is to provide a set of basic rules that allow for minimal coordination amongst members of a society. Think of it like traffic laws, right? These traffic rules, they exist to prevent accidents. They exist, to maintain the chaos on the roads so that the bikes and the cars, they can move smoothly. Similarly, the rules that are listed in the constitution, they help maintain stability, they protect the rights of citizens, they ensure fairness in a society. I hope the first function is clear. Okay, so we have understood that in order to, coexist peacefully and cooperate effectively in a society, we need some basic rules. But this brings us to another question: who gets to decide these rules? So one might say that in a monarchy, it is the monarch who decide these rules. It is the ruler who sets these rules. In an oligarchy, it is a select few people who hold power and wealth. But in a democracy, it is the people. We in India have a democracy, and this is exactly what a constitution does for a country. It decides who will make the laws and how the lawmaking process will work. Right? So, in a democracy, we ask, how will people make decisions? Should everybody decide, like as they did in ancient Greece, or we select representatives and these representatives make decisions on the behalf of the citizens? So constitution provides an answer to these questions. In India, for instance, this, the parliament has the power to make laws. We have the Lok Sabha, we have the Rajya Sabha. We directly elect MPs, Member of Parliament, to the Lok Sabha, and they make decisions on Janta's behalf. They make laws. So in India, the Parliament has the power to make laws. But then again, the question comes, who gave Parliament this authority, right? The answer is, it is the Indian Constitution. It is the constitution of our country which grants this power to the parliament. So without the constitution, there would be no parliament or any government. And this brings us to the second function, which is the constitution specifies who has the power to make decisions in a country, and it decides on how the government will be constituted. So we talked about who will make the decisions, right? The constitution specifies who will make the decisions, but the question is, to what extent? To what extent can the government exercise this power? Okay, so suppose the government introduces some policy which stops you from practicing your religions, or introduces a law which simply stops you from, say, dyeing your hair red, right? Now, any sane person would say that these laws, these policies are clearly unjust and unfair, even though they are made by the government. Now, this brings us to the third function, which says that the constitution sets some limits on what a government can impose on its citizens. So a constitution not only specifies who gets to make the decisions, but also limits the powers of the government. Now, why is this important? Because it ensures that the government does not abuse its power. The Constitution gives us a set of fundamental rights, FRs, which ensures this very function, right? They are listed in the part 3 of the Indian Constitution. So, if you look at the Indian Constitution, you will find that the fundamental rights are listed in part 3. And if you look at the articles, right, you will see that some articles, they begin with the state shall not, right? They follow this specific language. It is often expressed in the negative terms, such as the state shall not, right? So the constitution thus ensures that no authority violates the core fundamental rights of a citizen. It ensures that the government cannot act arbitrarily, randomly, meaning it cannot just arrest or say punish people without valid reasons. So, do try to look at the fundamental rights, Google them, and do let me know in the comments what did you find, if you did find anything interesting. The text also highlights this one point, that although we have fundamental rights in theory, on paper, but in actuality, in practice, are these rights absolute? So you might know this, but during national emergency, Article 19, which ensures right to free speech, is completely suspended. There are also certain reasonable restrictions of these rights. For example, in Article 19 again, the state, which is India, can restrict your freedom of speech and expression if it threatens the security of India or the public order or morality. So basically, we do have these rights that protect our freedoms, but are these rights absolute in nature? This is something that you need to ask yourself. Okay, so we have a third function also, which is the limiting power and ensuring rights. Moving forward, so we saw how the constitutions provides certain rights which limits the powers of the government. Now the question comes, are these rights enough to create a fair and just society? So let us consider an example, right? Under the right to freedom, if we see Article 19, Clause G, we have the right to practice any profession. However, let's imagine a child from a financially weaker background who dreams of becoming, say, a doctor or an engineer, right? While the state and anybody can legally stop them for pursuing this profession. Nobody can, physically stop them from pursuing their dreams, because then that would be a violation of their fundamental right. Their lack of access to quality education, their lack of access to resources or say financial support might make it impossible for them to achieve their dream. So no one would be physically stopping them or legally stopping them from pursuing the dream of becoming a doctor, but their circumstances, their lack of resources, their lack of proper education would make it impossible for them to achieve this very dream. So, this is where the concept of negative and positive rights come in. So, the text does not mention this concept, but I'm just, telling this for the sake of your understanding. So negative rights are those rights which stops the state from interfering. So you remember in the third function we did fundamental rights. Now some fundamental rights such as right to religion or right to freedom of speech, these are examples of negative rights, because the state has the duty of non-interference. So I had the right to religion or the right to freedom of speech, and the state cannot violate these rights. However, on the other hand, we have the notion of positive rights, which require the state to actively participate, to actively provide services and benefits to the citizens. For example, one such positive right is the right to education. This will become more clear when we look at the fourth function. So, India as a society has deeply entrenched inequalities, right? India has seen, historic injustices towards women, towards members of the so called lower caste, towards Dalits and other minorities and marginalized sections of the society. So, these negative rights or fundamental rights are not enough, right? Not enough to ensure a life of equality and dignity. So, in order for someone to enjoy the fundamental rights, the negative rights, they must have first access to resources, access to training as part of their fundamental, as part of their positive rights. So, the Indian constitutions sets certain aspiration and goals to create a more just and equitable society. These include ending inequalities such as caste discrimination and ensuring basic dignity to every person. Right now, these provisions are found in the fundamental rights such as right to education, which is Article 21A in the Constitution. Apart from fundamental rights such as right to education, we also have DPSPs. Now, what are DPSPs? DPSPs are directive principles of state policy, and these are written down in part 4 of the Indian Constitution. And DPSPs enable the government to fulfill these aspirations and goals for a society. They act as a guiding principle for the state. Now, the preamble also explicitly mentions goals such as justice, liberty, equality, fraternity, which represent the aspirations of the Indian society. So, the fourth function is to enable the government to fulfill the aspiration of a society and create conditions for a just society. Now, moving forward to our last function, the last and the fifth function, which is a constitution shapes the fundamental identity of the people. Now, you might say that it is not like people did not have identities prior to the constitution, but it's not like that. A constitution provided a certain political and a moral identity to the people of a nation. Before the constitution, people may have had different identities based on religion, their ethnicity, the language that they spoke, or the region from which where they belong. But by agreeing to a set of fundamental principles, but on a set of rules, they create a shared political identity as well as a moral identity. So, the political identity is all about the rules, the principles that define how a group of people choose to govern themselves. Right? It shows how a society organizes its government. For example, India's political identity, one might say, is being a democratic and secular nation. Right? This identity is built when people commit to a common system of governance. On the other hand, moral identity is more about the values, right? The ethics that guide how people and government should act. These include ideas like justice, fairness, you know, respect for others, right? The Indian Constitution promotes values such as liberty, equality, fraternity. As we saw, these ideas are explicitly mentioned in the preamble of the Constitution, right? Another example could be discrimination is not permissible, right? Thus, it creates a moral framework of how citizens should treat one another. So basically, constitution forms the identity of a nation, the fundamental identity of the people, by bringing together people from diverse backgrounds and uniting them under a common set of rules and norms. The text mentions, how most modern constitutions create democratic systems of governance, right? They protect individual rights. However, each constitution embodies a different understanding of a national identity, right? For example, the text mentions historically the German identity was closely tied with ethnicity. So, like, being German was closely tied to the idea of being ethnically German. However, in contrast to this, the Indian constitution does not link identity to ethnicity. You do not have to be part of a certain ethnicity or a certain religion to be part of India. So the basic idea is a constitution does not just set out rules for governance. It also expresses the fundamental identity of a people by uniting them under common values, under common rules and principles. So the fifth function is defining identity. Okay, so this was it. These are all the 5 functions. I have listed them out for you. You can pause the video and write them down if you want. So moving forward, now after looking at the functions, we could say that a constitution is a set of fundamental principles, laws and rules that outline how a state is organized, governed, and how power is distributed among its institutions, right? However, there are also codified constitutions and uncodified constitutions. The text mentions this, right? For example, in some countries, this document, the constitution, is very comprehensive and formal. Example, India and USA. We call them the codified constitutions. However, some nations like the UK, they do not have a single written constitution. Instead, their constitution is made up of various documents, various laws and court decisions, and they collectively perform the functions of a constitution. So they are called uncodified constitutions. So basically, we can say that a constitution is usually a single document or a set of documents outlining the structure of the state and its guiding principles. Now moving forward to the second part of the video. Now, one might argue that a constitution is just a book. It is just words written on paper. Why should people and why should the government abide by the constitution? Right? What is exactly the practical relevance and impact of a constitution beyond its mere existence as a written document? So, in the second part, we'll basically look at what makes a constitution effective. Why do people actually follow it? What makes it credible? So, let's begin. So, the first reason is mode of promulgation. Now, mode of promulgation means how a constitution is actually created and established, right? The process significantly impacts its success and acceptance. It really matters who has created it and how has it been created. Now, as the text suggests, constitutions crafted by military leaders or say monarchs or unpopular authority, they often fail because they lack a certain public support, or they lack legitimacy, right? Successful constitutions like those in India, South Africa, or the US, they have emerged from popular national movements. For instance, India's constitution was drafted by, if you know, by the Constituent Assembly between 1946 and 1949. And it drew legitimacy from the freedom struggle, yeah, and the participation of respected leaders. It was drawn up by people who enjoyed immense public credibility. Although the Constituent Assembly, when they were drafting it, they did not uh, they did not subject it to a public referendum. Public referendum means a direct vote, a yes or no, to the public, but it gained widespread acceptance through its inclusiveness and the representation of a diverse group of people. So, although not everyone was involved in the making of the constitution, after it was made, the people adopted it as their own. How? By abiding by its provisions, by following its rules. So the authority of people who enact the constitution helps determine in part its prospects for success. So in the book, you have the example of Nepal. So the constitution of Nepal, you would be surprised to know, was made 6 times, but finally in 2015 the seventh constitution was formed, and that seventh constitution, it gained legitimacy from being passed by assembly of elected leaders and not the monarchy. So it is important. The mode of promulgation is important in order to determine the success of a constitution. Now, the second reason is that a successful constitution, it ensures that all the members of the society have a reason to support it, right? If it fails to do so, it will lose legitimacy and fail to unite the people. So in the previous slide we saw, right, if the constitution has emerged from popular national movements, or they are drafted by popular leaders who enjoyed public legitimacy, the constitution is bound to be successful. So if the constitution also has reasons for people to support it, it will be effective. For example, if the constitution says, right, women will not have equal rights as men, they will they follow the constitution? Right, they won't follow the constitution. They would have no reason to follow the constitution. So a good constitution protects everyone's freedom, not just a particular group of people, but everybody's freedom and equality. It gives everyone a reason to follow it. So the Indian constitution, again for instance, strives to achieve this balance. So the substantive provisions, so substantive meaning essential or meaningful or fundamental provisions, refers to the core rules and principles that are outlined in the constitution. These substantive provisions, they include rights, the duties, the powers of individual and institutions, and these are they play a very important role in ensuring the success of a constitution. Okay, so moving forward to the third point, which is balanced institutional designs. Now, if you know, in India, power is horizontally divided among the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. We will individually see these and we will study them in detail in the later chapters. Now, there are also independent bodies like the Election Commission, right? Now, why do these systems exist in the first place? They help prevent any group or any particular individual from becoming too powerful or misusing their position. So, a balanced institutional design would mean that a constitution would try to spread the power across different parts of the government so that no single group, no single government or institution can control everything, right? This way, even if one part tries to break the rules, the other parts, the other branches can step in and stop them. Apart from this, a good constitution also needs to be, flexible enough to change with time, but not so flexible that it loses its strength or stability. In this regard, the Indian constitution is a, perfect example. It can change to meet new needs, but the core values stay the same. If you would like to, explore this further, do Google or read about the basic structure doctrine of the Indian constitution. The Indian constitution is also often described as a living document. So, you know, it 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 is not too rigid, not too flexible. And this arrangement ensures that, no section or group can on its own subvert the constitution, and it also makes sure that the constitution, keep on adapting to the new circumstances, and it does not break under the new environment, so as to say. So again, these are the pointers. I've listed them down for you. You can write them down or read them just once before we move forward to our third and the last part of this video, which is the Indian Constituent Assembly. So let us begin. The Constitution was formally made by the Constituent Assembly. Now, why the word formally has been used? Because we'll see how there were also other factors which aided the formation of the Constitution. So, the Constituent Assembly was formed through indirect elections, and the members of the Constituent Assembly were elected by the members of the provisional legislative assemblies, and the seats allocated were according to the cabinet mission plan. Now, the provinces under the British rule were allotted 292 seats, and the princely states had 93 seats, and the allocation of seats was based on population. So, roughly, the ratio that was followed was one seat per 10 lakh people. That is why it is written 1 is to 10 lakh. According to the cabinet mission plan, we also saw communal representation, as in the seats in each province, it was distributed among the major communities, which is the Muslims, Sikhs, and the general, which included non-Muslim and Sikh population. Um, each community selected their representatives through a system of proportional representation with a single transferable vote. Proportional representation is when you have representation with proportion to the population, and single transferable vote is a system, it is a method of voting, right? So, in a single transferable vote system, the voters rank their candidates in order of preference rather than just choosing one, which we do in the general Lok Sabha elections, where we follow the first past the post system. So I hope that is clear. Now, for the princely state, the selection of representatives was quite different, and it was based on consultation between the British government and the ruler of the state. So there was no fixed system for the selection of representatives from the princely states. Also, the first time when the Constituent Assembly met, it was before the partition, right? So its first sitting was on 9th December 1946, and then after partition, the assembly reassembled on 14th August 1947. I hope it is clear on how the members of the Constituent Assembly were elected, which was according to the Cabinet Mission Plan. Moving forward, if we look at the composition of the assembly, right? Although we saw how members were not elected by universal suffrage, right? It was not a direct vote. The members were indirectly voted to become a part of the Constituent Assembly. However, the Assembly did make efforts to be representative. So, if you see the composition, you will find that there were leaders from different religions, from different socio-economic backgrounds, leaders who had different ideological leanings, different from they were from different castes, right? If we look at it in terms of political party, we will find that the Congress dominated the assembly, holding about 82% of the seats, right? If we look at Congress at that time, it was in itself a very diverse party that represented many different views, right? It had members from different political leanings, from different castes, from different religion. So the Congress was itself a very diverse party. So even though the Congress was in majority in the Constituent Assembly, it does not mean that it was not a representative body. The text also mentions that how after partition in 1847, the seats from territories that became a part of now Pakistan were vacated. So this reduced the number of members to 284 who actually signed the constitution on 26 November 1949. Now the members, you have to keep this in mind, that they were deeply impacted from the horrors of partition. But despite the violence of partition, the members of the assembly managed to draft the constitution, even though they were under immense pressure, right? The framers learned from the horrors of partition and created a new idea of citizenship that was inclusive, which ensured that minorities would be protected and the religious identity would not affect citizenship rights. That is why you would see that the religion does not matter, or the ethnicity is not a big factor in determining the citizenship rights. Okay, so moving forward, the next part deals with the processes that were employed, during the formation of the constitution. So the Constituent Assembly was successful not only because it represented different sections of the society, but also because of its deliberative process, right? Now, members of the Constituent Assembly, they did not just represent their own communities, right? They discussed the constitution with the whole nation in mind. They made it, right, with the whole nation in their mind. So there were disagreements, but these were mainly about principles and not about personal interests, right? So the key issues, like whether India should be a centralized or a federal country, right? Or they debated on the relationship between states and the center, powers of the judiciary, whether to protect property rights, right? So these issues, these points were debated in detail. However, there was one thing, uh, which was accepted without much debate, which was the universal suffrage. Now, what made the Constituent Assembly powerful was these reasoned debates, right? The members argued their points with principled reasons, right? Not just their personal interest. They listened to each other, they tried to convince each other. So, whatever decisions were taken, it was taken through consensus. The intensive debates were a key part of why the Indian Constitution is so respected, right? If you want, you can read the Constituent Assembly debates, they are available online, and you will see why the Constitution is so comprehensive and so well respected, and often seen as one of the important moments in the history of constitution making. Okay, so apart from the principle of deliberation, the processes followed in the Constituent Assembly were also very important in shaping the constitution. So the assembly had 8 major committees, and each of these committees were responsible for drafting different parts of the constitutions, right? And these committees were headed by leaders such as Jawaharlal Nehru ji, Rajendra Prasad ji, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, Maulana Azad, and Ambedkar. These leaders were very different from each other, and they often disagreed with each other. However, they worked together to shape the constitution. Each committee would draft a specific section of the constitution, which would then be debated in the full assembly. So the goal was to reach a consensus. Now, what exactly is a consensus, you might ask? Now, a consensus is a process, it is a decision making process where the group reaches an agreement that is acceptable to all the members, right? So you have a consensus rather than just following the majority votes. A consensus requires discussion, there is negotiation, there is compromise, and then you come to a solution that everybody can support, or at least say live with it. So suppose you are you want to order pizza with your friends, right? But your friends want mushroom and you maybe want plain cheese as the topping. So now if you vote, the majority may win, but that one friend might feel left out. So instead, you find a solution and you decide, let us do an half and half pizza. So one side with mushroom and the other with cheese. So this consensus is all about finding a solution that works for everyone. In the Constituent Assembly, they did try to reach a consensus. However, if a consensus could not be reached, certain provisions were put to a vote. However, it was made sure that every issue or every concern raised during the debates was addressed very carefully and was responded to in writing. So the assembly met for almost 166 days over nearly 3 years, and its sessions were open to the public and the press. So it also promoted transparency. This careful, inclusive process, it ensured that the constitution reflected the broad range of opinions, views, and thus in turn shaped by reasoned debate. Now, no constitution is simply a product of the assembly that produces it, right? Similarly, the Indian constitution was also greatly influenced by the values and the principles that came to the front during the nationalist movement of for India's independence. So before even the constitution was created, the India's independence struggle debated important questions about the type of government we want or the values it should uphold. The objective resolution, which was moved by Jawaharlal Nehru, in 1946, it summed up these values, right? And it served as the foundation for the Constitution. It emphasized on ideals such as equality, democracy, sovereignty, and a global identity, ensuring that the Constitution wasn't just a legal document but a social document, a moral commitment to fulfilling the promises made during the struggle for independence. Now, what exactly was the objective resolution? It was something that was put forward by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru in 1946, and it outlined the broad goals and ideals for India's future after independence. So, if you want to know the exact date, um, it was moved in the Constituent Assembly on the 13th of December 1946, and it served as the moral and the ideological foundation for our Constitution, and it set the direction for the framing of the Indian Constitution. You could read the main points of the resolution. These are listed in your textbook. You can just go through them. They are very easy to understand. Now, moving forward is institutional arrangements. Now, we did this point when we were doing what makes the Indian Constitution effective, right? Where we studied its balanced institutional designs. So, the institutional arrangements of a constitution refers to how the various branches of the government are structured and balanced, right? So, in the case of India, the Constituent Assembly worked on finding the right balance between the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. We adopted the parliamentary system and the federal structure, which allowed for the distribution of power. So, in the parliamentary system, in the parliamentary form of government, the executive branch derives its legitimacy from the legislature. It is accountable to the legislature, which is the parliament, right? So the head of the government, which is the prime minister, is the leader of the ruling party which runs the government, and the president acts as a ceremonial head. It is a symbolic leader, while the prime minister holds the real power, right? And a federal structure is a system of governance where the power is divided between the central government and the state governments and the local regions, each having their own responsibility and authority. Also, one thing that you should keep in note is that the framers of the Indian Constitution, they did not just create these institutions from scratch, right? They looked at the experiences, they looked at the examples of other countries and took them to shape the constitution of our country, right? But we did not just simply copy, we carefully, curated these institutions to fit them and adapt them to suit India's context. So each decision was carefully thought out to ensure that it would work for India's unique challenges and unique needs and aspirations. So we were extremely lucky to have a assembly that, instead of being parochial, instead of being narrow minded in its outlook, it could take the best available things from the other parts of the world and make it our own. These are the list of provisions that we borrowed from constitutions of different countries. Do have a look at them before we move forward. Again, this is just a summary of whatever we have discussed so far in the part 3 of this video. um, you could write them down or just take a screenshot. Right. All right, this was it for this video. I will be uploading the next chapters very soon. So thank you so much for listening. See you in the next videos.